What's going on, everybody? It's the Fantasy Football Almanac back at it with another fantasy football video. Today we are going to be talking about lessons learned from week 12 of the NFL season. Before we get into it, if you guys could give this video a like. I'm answering every single fantasy football related comment. So if you guys have any questions related to fantasy football, I would love to help you all out. I want you guys to all win your leagues. And subscribe to the channel, turn that notification bell on so you don't miss another video. With that, guys, let's get right into it with the first game of the week. The first game I want to talk about is the Buffalo Bills versus the Detroit Lions. There's a few players I want to talk about. Start with the Bills side because the Bills won. First, we see Josh Allen put up yet another God-tier fantasy football performance, scoring basically 30 fantasy points. 29.92. I'll call that 30 in my book. 2 touchdowns and a rushing touchdown, 78 rushing yards. What more can you ask for in a fantasy football quarterback? He's easily the quarterback one here. With maybe an argument Pat Mahomes could do it, but I would much rather have Josh Allen, because Josh Allen simply has more rushing upside, although Pat Mahomes is probably the better quarterback. We see Devin Singletary get 8.5 points. He is utilized as the primary back, but again, in an offense that barely runs the football, that does not mean much. Isaiah McKenzie dropping 19 fantasy points, getting 10 total targets, 96 yards, and a touchdown. But the real notable performance here was the lack of production from Gabe Davis. 5.8 points. He has not been all that great this season. People are expecting him to be that wide receiver 2 in this offense that he simply hasn't been. Yes, he's had some boom games where he's had 2 touchdown games or 15 or higher fantasy points, 30 fantasy points, but he's also losing you weeks. So I don't know if I can necessarily trust Gabe Davis rest of the season. But anyways, let's move on to the Lions side, where we see Jared Goff put up a decent fantasy performance, 240 yards and 2 touchdowns. Jamaal Williams, again, looking like that running back 1, getting 18 carries. Yes, he doesn't get the receiving work. That is more for DeAndre Swift. But at the same time, Jamaal Williams is the running back 1 in this offense, which if you are a DeAndre Swift owner, I am very sorry to say, that is just annoying. And then we see Amon-Ra St. Brown start to really bounce back because during the middle of the season, he really wasn't really having that many great games. Now we see him have 10 targets, 9 receptions, 122 yards, and a touchdown. This is vintage Amon-Ra St. Brown. If you own him, you're going to be one happy man. But let's move on to the next game. The next game I want to talk about is the Giants versus the Cowboys. And this game, as a Giants fan, very painful. It was probably the least entertaining game of the Thanksgiving slate because, Bills versus Lions was wildly entertaining. So was Patriots versus Vikings, another crazy game. But either way, we see the Giants go up early. Cowboys end up taking the lead and just stick with it. Nothing the Giants could do. They score a garbage time touchdown. Terrible game from a Giants fan perspective. But we do see Saquon Barkley get decently heavily utilized. His day pretty much is salvaged by a touchdown, which is kind of sad to see for Saquon Barkley owners. We do see Gary Brightwell get decently utilized, and Matt Breida as well, more than in games past at least, which is somewhat of a concern for Saquon Barkley owners. Daniel Jones has a decent fantasy performance. 15 points. Nothing crazy here. Same thing with Dak Prescott, only putting up 15 fantasy points. No Giants wide receiver is really to be trusted here except for maybe Slayton. Slayton having 63 yards, 6 targets. Nothing crazy. I would not trust any of these guys. Richie James does have a salvageable fantasy performance with 12 points though. And then on the Cowboys side, we see the same annoying split between Ezekiel Elliott and Tony Pollard, both of these running backs, with Zeke getting 16 carries and Tony Pollard getting 18 carries. It is Zeke who gets into the end zone for this one, so Zeke does have the better fantasy performance, but this could have easily been Pollard if things had just gone a little bit differently. Dak does throw 2 interceptions during this game, but is still, a decent fantasy quarterback. You can trust him to at least have a good fantasy performance. And then Ceedee Lamb we see as the main beneficiary of these Dak targets, getting 11 targets for 106 yards. The next game I want to talk about is the last Thanksgiving game. It was the Patriots versus the Minnesota Vikings. This was a shootout through and through, which was pretty surprising because the Patriots don't often get themselves into shootouts. The Vikings do all the time, but the Patriots rarely do. But they end up getting into shootout here. Mac Jones looks pretty good, 382 yards and 2 touchdowns. He did kind of choke the game at the end there, but Still a good fantasy performance from a quarterback that you don't really expect with no rushing upside. Rhamondre Stevenson with 10 total targets, 9 receptions for 76 yards, no touchdown, and still has 15 fantasy points. But a lot of that is because Damian Harris wasn't really playing for most of the game due to a thigh injury, so we didn't really see him out there much. He did get 5 carries for 16 yards, but he looked limited. It wasn't really anything crazy for Damian Harris. That allowed Rhamondre Stevenson to take over. We see a lot of Patriots wide receivers having surprising amounts of success. Nelson Agholor having 15 fantasy points, Devontae Parker having 10, Jacoby Myers even getting 4 targets for 62 yards. I think mainly we're going to see Jacoby Myers be the beneficiary of most of these targets, but it is possible on any given week that the Nelson Agholors of the world, the Devontae Parkers of the world will be taking these targets away. So that's why Jacoby Myers is a little bit hard to trust, but I would still say he's a fine fantasy football option at like flex, probably a low-end wide receiver 2, high-end flex option. For the Minnesota Vikings, we see Dalvin actually not have that productive of a game, only 42 yards and 14 yards receiving, no touchdowns, so 7 fantasy points in total. We see Kirk ball out though, but it's mainly because of Justin Jefferson. I mean, Justin Jefferson, I wouldn't even say it's arguable at this point anymore. I mean, he's got to be the best wide receiver in the league, right? 139 yards and 1 touchdown. 24 fantasy points because he also had a completion. He's just absolutely ridiculous. I mean, what more can you ask for from a great wide receiver? I mean, he has to be one of the best wide receivers, if not the most talented wide receiver I've seen since probably like Calvin Johnson, which feels crazy for me to say, but he's really just that good. Especially the fact that, yes, I know Kirk Cousins is an underrated quarterback, but at the same time, he probably has the worst quarterback out of all of these really, really good wide receivers. I mean, we look at Jamar Chase, he has Joe Burrow, Matt Stafford, and Cooper Kupp. I mean, Matt Stafford's at least better than Kirk Cousins, I would think, even with this terrible, terrible season coming off the Super Bowl. Devontae Adams had Aaron Rodgers for years and years and years. And yes, now he's producing with Derek Carr, but we saw him with Aaron Rodgers for all of 7 years. So, I mean, Justin Jefferson arguably is the worst quarterback out of all those guys. But anyways, let's move on to the next game here, the Denver Broncos versus the Carolina Panthers. And this game was really interesting for a couple reasons. I mean, first we see Russell Wilson yet again just look terrible. I mean, I know what's going on. It's probably a lot to do with this throwing shoulder being injured, Hackett being a terrible head coach, but I'm just shocked Russell Wilson is this bad. I mean, he's had 20 fantasy points in 1 game this season, and he's played 10. So, I mean, at this point, Russ is benchable. You can't trust him at this point for the rest of the season. Maybe next season, once he gets his bearings back under him, he, maybe gets a surgery on the shoulder, possibly. I mean, you just can't trust him. He looks terrible out there. Latavius Murray is the lead back here, getting 13 carries, 92 yards. Latavius Murray is just, I feel like, loved by all these head coaches, even though whenever he goes out there, he's usually inefficient. This game, he proved to be efficient, so I take it back. I can't really roast him for that, but 13 carries, 92 yards. He doesn't really get the receiving work usually, but I mean, this is like a flex type of running back if he's going to continue to get this work, especially with Melvin Gordon getting cut. And then the Broncos wide receivers, not really much better. I mean, nobody was talking about Kendall Hilton before the game. I don't know if too many people were hyping up Brendan Johnson or Montrell Washington. I mean, I don't think any of these guys are really all that good. Sutton puts up 8 targets, 75 yards. Nothing crazy, though, because his offense stinks. Over on the Panthers side, there's actually a lot more to talk about, because Sam Darnold had 16 fantasy points, which almost feels like a career high, because, I mean, Sam Darnold stinks. Everyone knows that. 164 yards and a touchdown, and then salvages the rest of his day with a rushing touchdown. Donta Foreman getting 24 carries for 113 yards, 11.3 fantasy points because he didn't get a single target, nor did he get into the end zone. Chubb Hubbard, 17 carries, another 65 yards, so he was less efficient than Donta Foreman, as he's been for honestly a lot of the season. But at the same time, this is a little concerning if they are splitting carries nearly 50-50, because how are you going to be able to trust Donta Foreman if the game script ends up turning out negative, which it will for a majority of the time with the Carolina Panthers. The only wide receiver to talk about here is DJ Moore. DJ Moore looks really good out there. He caught a bomb touchdown. I forget exactly the yardage, but DJ Moore looked really, really good on that touchdown, which, I mean, might have salvaged his fantasy performance, but at the same time, we know this is who DJ Moore is. The next game I want to talk about is the Buccaneers versus the Browns. I'll start with the Browns because they've won. We see this split between Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt getting worse and worse for Kareem Hunt as the season goes on. I mean, Nick Chubb, 26 carries, 116 yards, and a touchdown. Even gets a target for another 16 yards. Kareem Hunt, only 6 total touches. This is embarrassing for a guy like Kareem Hunt, a guy who on most other teams would be the running back one, but because Nick Chubb is just so dominant, he is not. So I mean, I would really stay away from Kareem Hunt. I still think he's worth a bench spot because he is arguably the best insurance back in the entire NFL. But at the same time, you cannot start this guy. Amari Cooper, 12 targets, 94 yards. He looked good out there. He did have a very, very costly drop for the Browns. Didn't end up mattering because the Browns still ended up catching a win, but it could have really, really cost them. We also see Njoku make a crazy catch in the end zone. 7 total targets, only 29 yards, but a touchdown, which is really, really good to see for a guy like Njoku coming off that injury. Over on the Buccaneers side, there was really 2 people to write home about. I mean, Tom Brady looked good, but we see Rachaad White really dominate, especially in the receiving game. I mean, getting 9 targets, 9 receptions for 45 yards. Well, yes, the yardage isn't there. The targets are there, and that's really what we're looking for yet again. We also see Chris Godwin get 13 targets for 110 yards and a touchdown, which is really good because I love Chris Godwin. I am a huge Chris Godwin owner. This made me very, very happy to see. We see Mike Evans get shut down despite getting 9 targets. I mean, he looked clamped. He was frustrated pretty much the entire game. And Julio Jones not really doing much either. He did have one big reception towards the end of the game that almost could have gotten them the win with the field goal, but the Buccaneers did not call a timeout. But anyways, guys, let's move on to the next game. The next game, arguably the game of the week, was the Baltimore Ravens versus the Jacksonville Jaguars. We see Trevor Lawrence look good. We see Lamar Jackson look good. But I'll start with the Jacksonville Jaguars side. Jamycal Hasty taking over because Travis Etienne was questionable throughout most of the second half. And honestly, even in the second quarter, due to a foot injury. So they gave the ball to Jamycal Hasty. Jamycal Hasty looked good with it, getting 5 targets, 5 receptions, 67 yards, and a touchdown to go along with 28 rushing yards. I mean, maybe not the craziest game, but if Travis Etienne is to miss time, we now know who the running back 2 is. It's Jamycal Hasty. Definitely worth at least a roster spot, a flyer, but I'll be probably discussing him on waiver wire claims tomorrow. We see Zay Jones absolutely take over a guy like Christian Kirk and get 22 fantasy points, I mean 145 yards, and a 2-point conversion just to tack it in there. I think Zay Jones is a worth it pickup this week if he's somehow not rostered. I'd imagine he's rostered in a lot of leagues, but not all of them, so I think he's at least worth the roster spot. But over on the Ravens side, we see Lamar, of course, put up casually 23 fantasy points. We see Gus Edwards be the RB1, which might not last for long because we do have J.K. Dobbins coming back rather soon. And then on the wide receiver side, there's really nobody I want to discuss. I mean, Deshaun Jackson, you guys know what Deshaun Jackson is. I know what Deshaun Jackson is. He's one of those deep ball guys. He'll be involved twice a year, but not worth it to roster from a fantasy perspective. Duvernay, I really can't trust him that much either. Demarcus Robinson, of course, fell back to earth after his last game. I did not think he was worth the roster spot at all. He was literally just a trap. With Isaiah Likely sidelined, Josh Oliver did step up, but I'm not sure if he's worth the roster spot because once Likely comes back with his ankle injury, I imagine Josh Oliver will not really be a huge factor. But anyways, guys, let's move on to the last game. So the last game I want to talk about is the Texans versus the Dolphins, and I really don't even want to talk about this game because this game was terrible to watch. I mean, I had the Dolphins defense, so I was pretty happy about it from that perspective, but I also had Jalen Waddle, and Jalen Waddle did pretty much nothing because, I mean, they went up so early that he didn't need to. So we do see the Dolphins defense absolutely dominate, but there's not really much to say considering they're playing up against Kyle Allen. Honestly, there was really nobody to even talk about from the Texans side. Their 3 highest scoring players this week were Jordan Adkins, Brandon Cooks, and Dare Ogunbowale. None of these players are players like I can really talk about because they all stink, except for Brandon Cooks. Brandon Cooks just in a terrible situation, but I mean, there's really nothing you could say about any of these players. Same thing from the Miami side. I mean, Tyreek had an average day. Jalen Waddle had an average day. None of their tight ends really did anything. Jeff Wilson was the lead back here, but they ended up putting in Myles Gaskin, probably because Raheem Mostert was injured. And so Myles Gaskin was not a healthy scratch anymore, and also because they were up by so much so early that they didn't need to play Jeff Wilson. But anyways, guys, that is going to be it for the video. I hope you guys did enjoy. If you guys did, go down and give this video a like. I am posting part 2 probably sometime tomorrow, so I really hope you guys go ahead and watch that after this video. And of course, subscribe to the channel if you did enjoy. I hope you all did. But anyways, guys, that is going to be it from me. As always, have a good day, good night, and a good life.